that right there is very annoying, but I should have held L2 only, and then waited until I was in control, because these enemies take quite a while to shoot you, and that buys you enough time to initiate the charge attack, and then once you start the charge attack, you'll want to press right on the left analog stick, or left on the left analog stick in order to turn during the running animation, and this will allow you to kinda dodge the bullets, even though the enemies are still very accurate when it comes to shooting their machine pistols. And then once you've eliminated those two enemies, once you get rid of this guy, you will gain access to the key card that will allow you to get out of here. And we are going to progress onward with the actual meat of Chapter 3. Hello everyone, welcome to my Resident Evil 6, no hope difficulty, no life cube loss walkthrough. And this is Chapter 3 of Jake's campaign. And this is yet again another very short chapter. And this initial introduction, you're going to be in a bit of stealth. And I'm not too sure why they colored this room the way it is. I don't know if this is meant to be an homage to Mirror's Edge, but Capcom didn't even develop Mirror's Edge, so why are they making an homage to this game? Seems rather odd that they would just put this section, like, if they actually put it in homage, that doesn't feel very out of place, and it doesn't feel like it's so, like, overt in its expression, then it would actually make a little bit more sense as to why they would pay an homage to Mirror's Edge, but this is just so in your face with it being such an homage to Mirror's Edge that it just doesn't make any sense, and it feels very off-putting. So, I'm not gonna voice any more thoughts about that. Let's just progress onward, and just follow the path exactly like how I take it, and you will be able to take out these enemies. If these enemies spot you, they will spawn additional enemies, and they all will have melee weapons. Only Sherry will have to deal with guys with guns, and I find it very funny how when you're playing as Sherry, she says she needs a gun, yet these enemies are carrying machine pistols, so why can't the characters just grab their weapons and use them? It's so baffling, and it's just so immersion breaking, and it's the kind of error that you just have to wonder how it got into the game, and I don't like it whatsoever, and it just gives the enemies an unfair advantage, because at this point in time the main characters are just being mentally retarded at being able to do the simplest thing of picking up the enemy's weapons and using them against them. So silly that it works like that. But when you're in here, there is no threat to you. The only threats are to Sherry, and what you have to do when you're playing as Sherry is you need to wait until one of the enemies opens the door, and then you have to log that passcode in your head, because the passcode is different every time you play through Jake's campaign. And when Sherry inputs the passcode into this upcoming door, Jake can then use that same passcode to leave the security room and get past the locked door. And then from there you're able to get your weapons back, and then we're going to actually get into some actual combat. And my code here was rattle, weird lines, and the omega symbol. And it's best to just convert these to numbers, just go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's just a better way of remembering these symbols. And I'm just going to skip on ahead, because there's no threats here, and once we get our weapons back, there are going to be a couple of enemies right around this corner. I'm going to use the rifle on them. One thing I can't stand about the rifles on this game is because you're forced to go into the scope every time you're aiming, you can't swap shoulders, because when you're scoped in, you're forced to use the same button for swapping shoulders to zoom in. So in order to swap shoulders using the sniper rifle, you have to either drop your aim and press R3 to swap your shoulder, or when the main character is pulling the bolt back on the sniper rifle, you can press R3 then in order to swap shoulders. It's not too much of a big deal, because most of the time when you're using the sniper rifle, you are in a position of safety, but it still would have been nice if they inputted that as a feature, so that you didn't have to go through 3 steps instead of 1 step when it comes to swapping shoulders while using the sniper rifle. And when I'm using the sniper rifle, you might notice that I'm not pulling back on the bolt. I'm actually swapping weapons. That's to cancel the animation, and allows you to fire your weapons incredibly fast. And you need something like that, because if the enemies are going to cheat on this game, then you need such an advantage. I think the game practically forces you to understand the nuances to these particular mechanics if you're wanting to survive in this game and have a better time. Like, if they're going to make the chopper boss from Chris's campaign take 22 grenade rounds in order to take it out, and firing the grenade launcher takes such a long time if you're not using the shoulder swap trick or the weapon swap trick to fire it very fast, then that's definitely an indication that you've got to understand these nuances. And while I don't have anything against this particular mentality when it comes to understanding the nuances to a game, or the hidden mechanics to a game, or understanding hidden designs within a section, I like it better when you are not having to resort to such systems in order to accommodate for faults in a developer's parts. Like with the chopper, because of how shit the chopper is designed in this game, having to rely on such nuances in the mechanic of being able to fire the grenade launcher super fast just to get past how crappy that boss fight is, that to me is not the right application of that mentality. A great example of this kind of mentality done right is, ironically, in Resident Evil 2 Remake. Like, the G-Adult room in Resident Evil 2 Remake, the first time you enter that room, and you're having to get past the second G-Adult, if you're actually walking, you will not cause the G-Adult to come towards you. It will instead go on a different path, and you can use that moment to get past it. And for so long, playing Resident Evil 2 Remake, I did not know this was a thing, and so many other people don't recognize this, because people just assume the G-Adults know exactly where you are, and that's what I assumed originally, but with that sequence, they made an exception. And it's not a fault on a developer's part that I'm trying to utilize this mentality against the G-Adults. It's a very clever design that I'm definitely glad was implemented in Resident Evil 2 Remake, and it's one of the few moments in Resident Evil 2 Remake that I can actually appreciate something like that. I mean, for the most part, Resident Evil 2 Remake is a very disappointing game, but putting in such a design like that, pretty clever on new Capcom's part, and it's something that's just been very rare in the games that they've developed. But back to this game. The whole nuance to shooting, where you have the ability to swap weapons or swap shoulders in order to fire your weapons very fast and get past a lot of unnecessary recovery animations, it's very helpful in accommodating for faults in a developer's part when it comes to bad designs or bad enemies present within a section. And it's something you've got to practice, and it's something you need to get into the habit of doing. And it's a very similar system that I utilize in the Evil Within. When it comes to firing the sniper rifle in the Evil Within, swapping weapons is so helpful with getting rid of enemies very fast in order to balance out certain sections. And I'm sure the sections in the Evil Within are still very balanced when you're not using that trick, but it's still nice to do it nonetheless, and I just like getting into the rhythm of doing that. I just like how it benefits the flow of the gameplay. And with this game, it's not that it benefits the flow of the gameplay, it's actually mandatory to allow the flow to proceed properly. That's just what it feels like a lot of the times with the amount of poor designs present within this game. And like I said, despite the number of poor designs present within this game, I still love this game, and just the ambition that it had, and the number of Resident Evil designs present within this whole entire game. It's just such a shame that occurs 50% of the time, and then the other 50% is just very, very poor designs that just are the result of standardized, average designs getting in the way of actual good gameplay. But not to the same degree as Resident Evil 2 Remake, of course, because that game is just nothing but a standard average game. If you were to change the title of Resident Evil 2 Remake entirely, I'm sure you would still get the same game nonetheless. That's just what I would feel with Resident Evil 2 Remake. But enough about that, let's just talk about what's happening right now. So, for the entirety of Chapter 3, it's all taking place within this facility. And we're trying to gain access to these ID medals, and we need 13 of these ID medals in order to gain access to the security room that will allow us to contact HQ. And the way you get these ID medals is very interesting, and this is practically the older Resident Evil style of puzzle and key design present within this chapter. Because this out-of-place ID medal sequence where you're placing them in something equivalent to that of a slot machine, that screams older Resident Evil mentality. This goofy, archaic design, or I'm sorry, not archaic, arcadey design. And it's actually fun in this chapter because you can get a lot of these ID medals from set positions, and then certain enemies will drop the ID medals, but you can rely on getting the ID medals that are in set positions in order to speed up the sequence. And it's actually good that it works like that, because there are certain rooms in this chapter that you do not want to go into because they take so long to do, and the enemies are set up in some very dangerous positions, like the piano room. The piano room is a room I never go into because there's so many enemies, and they're outflanking you, they're just everywhere. And then there are certain enemies that just stay behind cover indefinitely, so it's impossible to kill them unless you somehow get lucky. And I can't believe Kill All Run players try to go for those players. Like, why the heck do they try to wait out an enemy just so they can actually kill them? Like, it's just a waste of time. Like, just trying to get rid of these insignificant enemies that mean nothing, and it somehow is meant to complement the gameplay in their minds. I'll never understand that, and why people embrace such runs. Oh, and that's a new enemy type right there. So, on this chapter, occasionally when you shoot enemies in the head, and this is also the case in Chapter 4, the enemies will mutate into bee heads, And the B-heads don't actually do any attacks. They're the most passive enemy in the game. The only attack that they can do is a range attack that just unleashes smoke. And the smoke will stun you, and it will prevent you from being able to fire your gun. And you have to get out of the smoke in order to fire your gun, and they're easily the most popcorn enemy ever in this entire game. Alongside the Messets, of course, and other enemy types, but these enemies are more so a nuisance than an actual threat. The only time the B-heads will actually be considered a bit of a threat is during the Ubisoft boss fight, where you're on top of that burning restaurant that's completely collapsed, because if they stun you, you will be opened up to being hit by the other enemies with guns. And aside from that sequence, they are never a threat. They're always a nuisance. And I'm just made my way over to the main hall area, and this is where we need to insert the ID medals. And I'm just going to deal with the Strelot. This was the room where I got screwed by the Strelot catching me out in a very clever move. So I had mentioned in my Chris's campaign walkthrough that I had seen unusual behavior by a Strelot where it was doing the startup frames for its animation where it fires its range attack at you, but as I was closing in on it, it actually seamlessly transitioned into an acid attack, so you've got to be very careful when you decide to rush Strelots when they are in the startup frames for their animation of doing a range attack, because they can immediately transition into the acid attack and just catch you out, and it's a very clever move, and it's a very rare behavior that the Strelats seem to exert. And while it is a cool idea to put in, it can be very annoying when it just catches you out and you just end up taking damage, unfortunately. And also this part right here, there are so many set placements for these ID medals, you will not have to deal with so many enemies. And I did get the A rank in this chapter because one of the reasons was I didn't kill enough enemies, but who cares? I don't see how that promotes skill, just being forced to kill a bunch of insignificant enemies. If people are going to associate S rank with actual skill in this game, then that right there is just a misrepresentation of what skillful play actually is. Skillful play is actually doing the kind of runs that I'm doing right now with no life cube loss and intelligently dealing with the enemies, understanding the hidden mechanics and the advanced mechanics of Resident Evil 6 to deal with the enemies, finding the proper optimized path, and you're not being forced to kill all the enemies. Like the Resident Evil way is knowing when to kill and when not to kill, because not only does it benefit the flow of gameplay, but it encourages you to save on your ammunition intelligently. And I don't know why Resident Evil 5 and 6 have this whole system where you're ranked based on the number of enemies that you kill. Why are you forcing the player to drag out the game more than necessary to get a pointless rank? And also with accuracy, like what does accuracy have to do with skill? And when you factor in just how terrible the aiming is on this game, where the dot just sways however it wants to and doesn't stay in the center of the reticle, and you're just having to constantly readjust your aim, like, is that really skill? That's just tedious gameplay. And other factors involved with S rank, none of them have to do with skill whatsoever. But by the way, I should mention, if you put in 16 medals, I think it's 16 medals for this statue here, if you put that amount of medals into the statue, you will gain access to the Bear Commando, but the Bear Commando, you already gain access to it by the end of this chapter, because what the game does is, if you don't pick up the new weapon in a chapter, it will give you that weapon in the next chapter at the very beginning. And there's no reason to use the Bear Commando for this chapter, because the grenade launcher and the machine gun rounds that you get for the Bear Commando don't really help in dispatching the enemies. The weapons that you already have are pretty good for Chapter 3 at the moment. And the Bear Commando is going to be helpful in Chapters 4 and 5, because when you gain access to the grenade launcher rounds, it can be very, very handy for dealing with a lot of enemies, and it allows you to bypass mutations. Like, if you hit an enemy directly with a grenade, it will just blow them up entirely and blow them into little bits and pieces, and it prevents them from transforming. And the same applies to the remote bombs as well. Explosives are really good for bypassing a lot of mutations in this game, and it prevents chrysalid mutations, because a lot of the chrysalid mutations that you will encounter in Chapter 4 of Jake's campaign, there's so many chrysalid mutations that can occur that dealing with them can be very difficult if you don't have the right resources necessary or you're in a really bad environment. And using that tactical mindset with being able to strategically use explosives to bypass enemy mutations is really cool. But go ahead and use your sniper rifle to clear out these LMG guys, because they are pretty good at hitting you given their perfect aim, as is the case with every single gun enemy in this game. And try your best to preserve your Magnum ammo. The Magnum is going to really come in handy for that first gunfight you get into Chapter 4, because that gunfight in Chapter 4, it is honestly the hardest encounter in this game, because you are put in the worst possible environment for dealing with so many enemies and also a chopper that is so bullshit in its designs. And if you want to understand the kind of problems that you encounter with the chopper, check out my Chris's campaign walkthrough, because the chopper is easily the most broken thing in Resident Evil 6 by far. Not only does it have the ability to fire its machine gun indefinitely without any kind of cooldown, but the spotlight that it uses can actually stun you, and the stun is so broken and poorly programmed that it just triggers whenever it wants to, and you can even get very glitchy stun animations where you get at least 3 stuns in about 1 second. How on earth is that acceptable? Why the heck should the spotlight even stun you? You're not looking at the spotlight. If you were looking directly into the spotlight, it would definitely stun you, but even then that shouldn't even be a mechanic. Why can't you just shoot the spotlight out? Like in Resident Evil 4, when you were in the beginning of Chapter 5, there was that spotlight that you could shoot, and it turned it off. And if you shot it before the checkpoint, you didn't have to constantly shoot the spotlight every time you restarted the checkpoint. So if that mechanic already existed in Resident Evil 4, why is it not back in this game? I mean, like, why is it that they remove so many logical designs in this game when it comes to mechanics like that? Like, imagine if you could shoot the spotlight out from the chopper, you would not be dealing with any glitchy stun animations and moments where you get stunned but then the enemies don't get stunned, because that occurs way too much in this game. And this right here, this cutscene will trigger when Sherry is the one that triggers it. If you yourself trigger the cutscene, you can still run, and you can even slide while that slow motion event is happening in order to gain some distance. And I'm just going to move on. This sequence right here is another great example of cutscene screwing you, and it's an accessibility option that doesn't deserve any place in this game because it's not an accessibility option, it's just a hindrance. That's what it is. But right now, the enemies are moving during this cutscene. Look at that. I could have lost my life cube just then. So it's best to clear out any enemies that are right near the switch before you decide to pull that switch. However, if the tank is aiming in your direction, you've got to be very careful. And also, you are not safe when you're over here. The tank will not be so much of an issue because the only way it can hit you is if you're lingering on one side for way too long. But the enemies that you just jumped past, they can attack you. And this is another sequence where you really gotta wonder why there are so many enemies in this sequence and why Kill All Run players bothered wasting their time with this section. Like, why on earth are you wasting time trying to deal with a bunch of insignificant enemies and you're dragging the section out and you're practically turning the game into a slog fest? You're practically a drug addict seeking a fix with the amount of drugs they've probably taken to develop such a tolerance. They need more of a dose to achieve a greater effect, and that's just very feeble. That's exactly how I would describe such runs. Feeble. And then people try to say, oh, it's the most fun run ever, you'll really enjoy it, and it actually benefits professional play, it'll really benefit you in the long run. Which all I have to say to that is, can you quit it with the paid advertising? What exactly am I going to learn that is so different to what I'm showcasing right now? And somehow this is meant to be professional play, this is something that's meant to garner you so many views. Well, if you're getting views, then it's definitely clear that the people who are following this kind of nonsense are the kind of people that do not understand what skillful play is, do not understand what fun is. They're practically no different to followers in that cult who have very low self-esteem and are just trying to fulfill the wishes of their leader. But that is the end of this chapter. I got the Bear Commando, and here's a blooper here, and it really showcases why this cover system is horrendous. Watch. Look at that. I go to shoot him, but because I'm aiming and it's the same button for going into cover, I went into cover, and it completely cancelled out my ability to deal with that guy, and he got a free pass in hitting me. What a load of shit. How on earth did they come to that decision? Did they not come across this issue countless times when designing the cover system on this game? Why can't they make it like Resident Evil 5, or why can't they just make it where you hold L2 and you press X to go into cover? This happens every single time, every single chapter I go into, every single playthrough I go into, I'm always encountering this issue with the cover system. This is easily the worst cover system ever, alongside Operation Raccoon City's cover system. And I don't even know which is worse, because Operation Raccoon City's cover system, you just went right towards the cover and it was automatic, and at times the game improperly placed you in the cover, so at times you had your body exposed from the cover and the enemies could actually hit you when you're behind the cover. But in this one, every time you're trying to aim, you just go into cover, and you gotta stand so far away from the cover in order to ensure that you can safely dispatch the enemies. It's just such a tedious process. Did these people who designed the cover system not play a game that actually has good cover? I mean, why is it such a problem to put in a different kind of button command for the cover system? It's not going to impact any other systems. I mean, they already have the L2 and X combination in order to go into cover. Why can't it just be that, as I've already explained? It's not impacting the gameplay. It's not exactly interfering with other mechanics. Why can't it just be that, or any other button prompt? That's just common sense when designing a fundamental mechanic that doesn't even feel so fundamental in this game, because you spend more time utilizing the third-person cover trick to deal with the guys with guns, to actually balance them out, to actually not encounter their bullcrap designs and their perfect aim, and the high damage that they can do with the amount they can just knock you over. I don't get it. I really don't. But that is the end of Chapter 3 of Jake's campaign. Stay tuned for the future chapters. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.